There were a couple of quick questions that related to the definition of the term. That term was entitlements. Entitlements because it means something different when we're talking about planning than when you're turning on the news station and hearing about entitlement report. So, Andrew, if you would like to, Russell, define entitlements in terms of housing.
Sure. Entitlements in this context would be land use approvals such as rezonings or subdivision plats or any of the various approvals that come out of the planning department and planning commission.
Exactly. So in other words, it's what you're permitted or entitled to use your land for based on zoning or other development regulations. There are a number of questions to deal with parks and park issues. And so if you pass the microphone over to Andrew, that would be good. One question actually deals with the relationship between parks, trails, and transportation. And the question is the metric of households within 2.5 miles of a trail network. Are we designing a trail network for citizens to drive to, or should it be part of an integrated transportation network in the Parks Master Plan?
That's a very good question, and I think that it gets back to the level of service tiers that we talked about. And I think in certain parts of the city, there's an expectation that people are going to drive, and in other parts of the city, I think there's an expectation that people might want to walk or bike to a trail. And the actual metrics that we used for the level of service standards came from the survey that we did. So we actually asked people how far they'd be willing to walk or bike to use a trail, and those metrics actually come from the community survey.
Another park and revenue-related question dealt with an observation that some wonderful resources like the Rose Garden Will Rogers Park are underused for events, and that renting space or utilization of space for community events could be a good source of revenue. Has attention been given to actively developing parks and public buildings as revenue sources through hosting events such as weddings?
Yes, actually the city does take advantage of charging for use of facilities, and actually Oklahoma City does a pretty good job compared to some of its peers in generating revenue from its parks. But there are actually always additional ways that you could generate revenue in parks in terms of leases and concessions and facility rentals. There are actually a number of options that we have in the Parks Master Plan that cover additional ways to generate revenues in the park system.
And while I hate to bombard you with questions, here's another one. I would like to see edible food forests integrated into our park system. And are there elements in the Park Master Plan to deal with using green space for purposes such as community agriculture or gardens or other such things?
That is a question that's come up during the process of the Parks Master Plan, and while it's not specifically mentioned in there, there are a number of cities that do allow for community gardens or urban agriculture in park space. I think there may be some particular issues here around maintenance and whether if those spaces are left up to the community to maintain and then they're not maintained, what is the city's role in that? So I think that there may still be some issues that need to be resolved if that were to take place.
And I should point out that we have been working on urban agricultural ordinance for a while, and that is anticipated to go to the City Council in early December. So that's going to address the capacity to be able to develop community gardens in a number of different forums within the city, as well as urban farms and everything basically that relates to the growth of food within the city boundary.
There are a couple of questions to deal with the interesting subject of housing affordability. And the question being, is there analysis within the housing studies that addresses the needs of specific price points of housing and specifically affordable workforce housing and strategies to address that development?
The short answer on that is no. However, let me expand a little bit. We, in looking at all the different housing options and the way that the market is performing, we considered taking cost into account and then realized it was a factor that would be very difficult to stay on top of, given the wide range of markets that we were looking at. So we narrowed the focus to product type and thought that that alone was actually a significant accomplishment. That said, we do affordable housing studies for cities across the country, and it's a growing problem. Wages are stagnant. Generally, for the last decade, wages have grown at we've actually lost ground in terms of the median wage from 2000 to 2010. The last couple of years have started to turn that around, and so I think we've hit bottom, but nonetheless, for the decade, wages are down. And when you start to bifurcate, or when you start to cross-tabulate that and break it down by educational attainment and other types of factors, there's serious disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So there's cause to be concerned about that, and at the end of the day, it also impacts a community or region's ability to provide a good labor supply across all wage levels. So a lot of reasons why communities should be focused on that workforce housing element and ensuring that there's an adequate supply of housing relative to the wages and an adequate labor pool, and altruistically reasonable opportunities for everyone across the economic spectrum. So it would be nice to have it in there, but given the complexities of everything else, we did not include it in the study.
We only had a certain amount of money, so we can't ask these guys to do everything, but affordable housing is a key policy issue for Oklahoma City, and even though this is one of the most affordable markets in the country, there's always going to be a problem at that lower end. The income disparity that Andrew talked about is becoming more and more of a problem for the capacity to be able to provide affordable housing. We have tried to emphasise at least the capacity to include affordable housing in what we're doing in the downtown area. We've been applying our federal funds over many, many years to try and address this, but it falls far, far short of what the need is. So we're taking a different look at how we do that, trying to be more strategic. And I've had discussions with officials from the Department of Housing and Urban Development about taking that more strategic, needs-based approach, and I believe that we will probably be doing a housing survey for the entire metro. I think the HUD wants to do the whole state, but we will at least have that information at the city level that we can then hopefully convert into policies based on a clear understanding of what the need is and options for how to address that. So it is important. It'll be included in the plan. You're not going to have the specifics in the plan, but it's something that we're already working on, and with the adoption of the comprehensive plan, it will provide further direction for us to be able to work on.
A number of the presentations, both in terms of preference surveys and some of the specific presentations, address the issue of sidewalks and walkability. Does the city have an active plan to replace existing crumbling sidewalks in the inner city?
Sidewalks, as I mentioned earlier, have risen to the fore in the minds of everybody, it seems, over the last 10 years, which is great. And there's a component, obviously, in MAP 3 to address sidewalks. There was a significant component in the last general obligation bond, and I would anticipate in the next general obligation bond that there'll be an even larger proportion allocated towards sidewalks. I believe there's additional money that's going to be allocated even in support of the sidewalks that are included in the MAPS program. staff in the planning department have analysed where those sidewalk needs are, and that was work that informed another analysis through the maps office. So we've got a lot of information on where the gaps are, where the problems are, and so it's just a matter now of allocating the funds when those become available. But it is I think it's a really high priority for the city.
Another transportation question, I think for Rick. Why have we not, and when will we have public transportation to and from the airport?
I don't know the answer to when. I think if you're going to have a successful connection to the airport, you've got to give it a chance to succeed, and unfortunately we've not been able to do that. If you think about, if you've used public transportation from airports in other cities, it's when you get on it, you want to know that's where you're going to go, and it's a direct connection to, and there might be multiple drop-off points, but at least you know your hotel's included in that. In our case, in the past, when we've made an airport connection, it's been part of a transit route, and so it's rather circuitous to go from the airport to downtown or Meridian Avenue, if that was the case, because we've got other stops in between, and it takes a long time to do it. So that in our fixed guideway study, we did have a connection to the airport. It was a rubber tire connection that we were proposing in that study, something called bus rapid transit. And without getting into a lot of details, essentially what that is a vehicle that basically runs an express route and makes very few stops in between. I think that, you know, it comes down to cost. You know, we've talked to hotel operators, owners and operators, from the standpoint of their interest in having us do it and their willingness to contribute to the cost of doing that. We've not really received a lot of warm response to that. There are those who do run their own shuttle services, and we've tried to make the argument that if we could get enough hotels to combine their resources, that it can help defray the cost and possibly make it more practical for us to take that on. But until we either get a stronger commitment financially to do it, or the private sector is willing to help us do it, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And if we are going to do it, we need to do it in a way that it's got a chance to succeed, and that is basically a dedicated bus that goes to hotels directly and has a regular service that runs back and forth, so you've got a schedule that you can follow and easily understand.
It's an interesting question because the age groups change and presumably their preferences change as well. The question is, the preferences that are shown in the survey by Generation Y consumers for different housing choices, higher density housing, transportation choices and so forth, may change over age. How do we manage the prediction that Generation Y may, the current Generation Y, as they age, may resemble some of the preferences of older populations?
That's a great question, and just to rephrase it, our Gen Y is a Gen Y cohort just interested in vibrant urban places for about 5 years, and then they're going to migrate out to good schools and stability and predictability like previous cohorts have done before that. It's a little hard to tell because we don't know. It's a little bit of looking into that crystal ball. There will be, there have been some studies done. There's a ULI report out with an extensive survey specifically just to Gen Y to try to estimate what's going to go on with Gen Y. And I think that there is some that will do that. There is, however, a continuing desire on the part of Gen Y for connectivity. And whether that connectivity occurs electronically or socially or physically, they will seek out place. And they will seek out place, even if it's ownership with a family, in larger dwelling units than a small rental apartment. What we've seen is that the markets that offer ownership product that has walkable destinations to local retail, those are very compelling to that kind of move up Gen Y market. So I think that it'll be a combination, but they still will look for that, even in greenfield settings. I mean, that's another thing that's interesting, is just the role of master plan communities and new town centers in greenfield settings. It's very compelling, particularly for the Gen Y, to move into the those environments, because it's kind of the best of both worlds, where there is new product, fresh, clean, what have you, but yet it's in these walkable environments with destinations that are relevant.
So here's a question that relates very well to that. How does the retail plan and the recommendations focused on centers, corridors, and nodes relate to the goal of increased walkability of lifestyle in neighborhoods?
That is a perfect segue. The retail, to the extent retail can be incorporated into neighborhoods, whether they be existing neighborhoods that are designated for infill or new greenfield neighborhoods, and it's tough because there's a reason why the retail fabric has developed the way we recognize it. There's something about big box retail that's very efficient from a consumer and from a producer. You get very efficient labor, very efficient delivery, and you get cheaper prices, and it's all works. So we're cognizant of the fact that big box is not going away. That said, to the extent that small pockets of retail can be incorporated into the plan, particularly into redevelopment areas or into greenfield areas of a scale that works, it will be, the market should resonate, and the market should gravitate to that in a significant way based on what we've seen in other communities. But you do have to go in with your eyes wide open and recognize that the relationship of rooftops to retail, it takes quite a bit of rooftops to support these small pockets of neighborhood retail, because you still have all the conventional dollar flow to strip centers and big boxes.
We've talked pretty extensively today about demographics, and one participant today raises, I think, an interesting and challenging question about demographics. A core of many of the challenges discussed today is Oklahoma City's large Hispanic population in relation to a lot of different systems. How do we bring a Hispanic population into the leadership of the community, into the mainstream systems of the community? I had a chance to talk to this person. He was talking about the separateness of first generation immigrants, for example, from the rest of the city. How do we address that?
Well, it is an interesting, it's a very interesting question, because it's something that we've thought about a lot, because the Hispanic community is the fastest growing ethnic demographic in the city. And at this point in time, we're politically relatively invisible, economically self-sufficient in a lot of ways, and they're generating their own businesses, so it's a very self-starting thing. It's not, I would say, perhaps as integrated as other parts of the city, but nevertheless, I mean, there's probably a couple of options for how the Hispanic Latino community can get involved. One is to insert yourself, obviously, because I think this is a town that is very open to people with good ideas expressing them and getting involved. That's one way to do it. I think that's probably a little harder with the first generation, who feel a little more uncomfortable about doing that, but I don't see that so much with second and particularly third generation. Those people are very, very willing to get engaged in everything that's going on in the community. We are talking to some people who want to play a more active role in the community, so it's beginning to happen. And if you look at Texas, for example, which has had a stronger Hispanic population for a longer time, they are exceptionally active. The mayor of San Antonio is Hispanic, and they have a pretty large percentage of Hispanics in that community. But you see a lot more elected officials in Texas and New Mexico and other places that have that longer history, and that is going to occur in Oklahoma City. Another way for this to happen is really for some of the existing leaders to bring these people along and get them engaged and show them around and enable them to connect with the existing power structure within the community. It's going to happen. It's really a matter of how quickly it happens. But I think that we're going to see within the next 10 years quite a bit of difference. It's not going to take long if we get the first couple of elected Hispanic officials, and there's going to be a whole host of issues that the Hispanic community is concerned and interested about that are going to begin to rise to the fore of the public dialogue.
I would also tend to make the argument that that we tend to lose historical perspective, and that is that the perceived separateness of first-generation immigrants now is not particularly different from the separateness of first-generation immigrants 60, 80, 100 years ago, when the first generation typically speaks its own language, whether 100 years ago it was Yiddish, German, Russian, or whatever, and now those vestiges are gone. The first generation is busy trying to make a living, trying to survive, trying to figure it all out. By the second and third generation, that integration has fully happened. So history repeats itself. We get very impatient right now because we expect it all to happen right away, but it is an evolutionary process. A couple of questions about community design and appearance. One is, how is community cleanliness tied to community appearance, and what recommendations might the plan make related to that issue of just overall property maintenance?
We did have some images in the 124 stack of slides that showed properties that were old and not in good repair, and those, as you can imagine, got very negative ratings. I think we had one in the presentation today. I think that one of the solutions towards this, because I think it's a key step to maintain the existing assets, would be small districts, and this is some of the recommendations, and you can drill down into the report if you're interested. But there is a whole section on organization and management for each of the prototypes. And in many cases, there's a business improvement district that's recommended that takes on operations of a center or of an area. It's a small-scale self-taxing district that ultimately generates sufficient revenue for their own trash, delivery, flowers, banners, marketing in some cases, and it focuses just on one very narrow geographic patch, and thus the attention to detail and the quality goes up. So that is part of the recommendations, and it certainly is a good idea and something to pay attention to.
I think people just having a sense of pride in wherever they are, whether it's the residential area or commercial area, that becomes a self-reinforcing protective mechanism. So if the buildings are deteriorated, if it looks like it's not cared for, then you tend to get a lot more trash there. If people start to pay attention, then hard to believe, but there are a lot of people who are the normal trash throwers who think twice about it. They don't do it because they know that area has got people caring for it and watching over it, and they're less inclined to throw their trash in those areas. So it just requires everybody buying into that as a goal for the district and saying it's important, and then it becomes self-reinforcing.
Here's an interesting question that combines parks, retail and commercial revitalization and policy and community needs. The city needs more green space, not just parks. Has any thought been given to converting unpopular business zone tracts to green space? With respect to parks, we need 3 to 4 more open nature parks. So the issue deals with the development of simple multi-purpose green space where development appears to be unsustainable or on the edges of commercial districts and no longer function as business areas.
I think that the plan doesn't address this specifically, but the plan, the Parks Master Plan does highlight areas where additional parks might be needed. And I think that to the degree that when the city then looks to see where they're going to put parks, if there is underutilized land in those areas, whether it's zoned for industrial or commercial or residential or anything else, that might be an opportunity to purchase that land to create a park. So I think that the idea of using underutilized land as open space, whether it's a park or other open space, is a very good idea. It makes perfect sense to be able to use land in that way.
Great idea. We have an oversupply of retail. We have national retailers that are reluctant to invest. We've got these corridors that are looking for uses. Makes all the sense in the world. That said, you're going from a retail designation that had, significant, at one point in the recent past, significant revenue on an annual basis with, pick your cap rate, but you get a land value that can be much higher than parkland. So obviously it would take a significant investment on the part of the city to be able to make those conversions. I am intrigued with the idea in part because if you think about where residential growth will occur, will it continue to go further and further out, or are there infill opportunities closer in? And the infill is dependent on amenity, and the infill is dependent on premiums that can be generated for amenity. And there's a symbiotic relationship here that could work out. Because the market's not going to gravitate to these infill locations without some kind of amenity and without some kind of differentiation, and this very well might be the idea. I want to bridge back real quickly and mention study a couple reference points to the whole notion that Gen Y. I've been in some presentations where people talk about Gen Y as Gen Rent, and in fact, suggesting that they're a very transient bunch that will move from city to city. And ultimately what's happening to this cohort over time. Research shows that when asked about ownership down the road, Gen Y matches larger national demographics almost to the percentage point. About 2/3 state that they aspire to be homeowners at some point in time. 1/3 talk about being renters in perpetuity. And that matches national statistics on tenure. The other thing I want to point out is that we just completed a study where we evaluated small lot, small home, walkable developments. And the question was, does the market discount the value of the real estate in those developments because it is smaller homes, smaller lots, more compact living, or is there a premium? And we found consistently in paired analysis of conventional and small lot walkable communities that the markets will assign anywhere from 15 up to 25% premium on a per square footage basis for housing in high amenity, small lot, small home projects. So I think that it is a natural progression for some of these Gen Y cohorts to move into ownership in these different types of master plan or different types of communities where the product is different. And I think that that's a specific example of when it comes together in the right configuration, people will pay the freight to actually get into these communities, even though it looks different from conventional product.
Here's a question that I would direct to Terry. We have about 7 minutes left in this panel, and this one would take about 7 hours to answer. The question is, how do we plan to address urban sprawl? Is this a priority moving forward? Difficult question to answer in a few minutes, but what I think would be, useful would be to talk a bit about how the scenario analysis helps to frame that debate and establish a way in which the city can, number one, establish whether what we typically call urban sprawl or decentralization or whatever is a good or bad thing, and depending upon the outcome of that decision to develop policies that are appropriate to those decisions.
Let me start by saying language makes a big difference here. So one person's sprawl is another person's home. And you need to be careful about using normative terms like that. The kind of thing that we're doing, we tend to stay away from the term sprawl, and we talk about development patterns, and we try to talk objectively about the amount of density that's there and the type of housing that's there. So here is a neighborhood that is a single-family neighborhood of, pick a number, 2 units per acre. Somebody might call that sprawl, others might call it desirable suburban amenity. So that's the first thing I would say about that. The second thing is that the tools that we have available allow us to look at those different patterns. So we can now populate different parts of the city with those patterns and then talk about what happens as we do that. There is certainly strong theoretical argument, if not ample empirical evidence, that our public policies, I'm not talking about Oklahoma City now necessarily, I'm talking about all over, have often, in the interest of economic development, have put facilities in place at less than full cost, and that those costs then have induced decentralization. Here's a new road out here, you don't have to pay for that, we'll put the sewer in for you, etc. The trend now, clearly with fiscal conservatism and fiscal difficulties, are to try to recapture more and more on the public side of the cost of the infrastructure. As that happens, if that happens, then there will be a natural tendency for the price of decentralized, non-proximate development to go up, and that increase in cost will start reducing that. So there's a market argument for how things are going to change anyway, and as we start moving through this. A lot of people believe that the combination of the inability to keep creating roads at the rate that we have, higher prices of gasoline, etc., will also encourage centralization. There are counter arguments to some of that also, but I think for me let's see, it was a 7-hour question that I've now taken 4 minutes on. Remind me what the question was. I've now talked about sprawl and
being an oil or carbon-based energy producer, obviously Oklahoma and Oklahoma City are very identified with these energy sources, and the associated pressure to remain the same. How does the plan keep Oklahoma City from overlooking the importance of implementing renewable energy as it comes of age?
The plan is not going to be specifically, it's not going to specifically favour any form of energy. I mean, the point of the plan is to develop a community that can respond to any number of market trends, and one of those will be energy. We just happen to have a base of oil and natural gas-based companies here, but the world is changing, and wind energy and solar energy and other forms of energy generation are becoming cheaper, and there are it's possible that those provide opportunities here as well. We do have a large number of wind generators in the state already. The Oklahoma City area has been evaluated as being better suited to solar rather than wind, although we pull a lot of wind energy from the farms of Weatherford and the Blue Ridge. So it's not going to make any kind of policy position on that is just going to talk about leaving ourselves open to whatever the market heads towards, and we're cognizant of the environmental impacts, and that Oklahoma City has to play a part in that discussion because climate change is a reality, despite what some people may say, and it's necessary for us to address the consequences of that. Those aren't maybe as measurable or visible to some people, but the trends are very apparent and clear if you read any of the research data around the world. So we are going to be cognizant of that.
We've almost got all of the questions answered, so that would be good. A question that relates to community appearance and to the relative nature of that. Elaborate on design guidelines. It's difficult to legislate taste. As a developer, I find our single-family design guidelines are difficult to establish and to enforce. So how do you develop or advocate design guidelines which generally reflect community preferences?
It's a good question. I'm hesitating because I don't know what avenue to take. I think that the specific tool that could be the most helpful here isn't so much design guidelines to be interpreted by a design review board, if you will, unless you've got a very unique historic setting or just a unique context. I think what we've seen to be more effective would be form-based codes, where it's clear what the expectation is in terms of the built environment, and yet in terms of the design, there's some flexibility in terms of how each site is executed. But the form-based code itself sufficiently lays out what the civic room looks like and how the buildings frame that. I have years ago been staff to a DRB as part of a town government, and design review is very vague and fuzzy, so I'm not sure that it's very, very difficult to regulate good design. So perhaps steering away from the guidelines and more towards form-based code provides clarity and still leaves some latitude for individual interpretation on a given site.
And the other part of that is to actually get some stuff on the ground here that is not yet in the market or not well represented in the market here that people respond to well. There is that reluctance to try something different, but once you get something there and it works, and people see that, and then they tend to replicate it. And that's how we get there eventually.
A question that deals with life cycle costs projects. Building things are great, but why don't projects like MAPS 3 have a dedicated operation and maintenance fund?
That's a policy question. Nobody here has had any role in the determination of how the MAPS program is put together. I think it's a legitimate question. The belief is that the economy expands in response to MAPS, and that additional revenue helps to pay for that. Otherwise, it's a matter of squeezing from elsewhere. What is the priority? It's all a matter of priorities again. I think it's worked pretty well so far, so we'll see how that continues going forward. That's a question better directed to a council person.
So with that, oh yes, Terry.
Very briefly, because this touches on fiscal, the life cycle cost is critical. I mentioned in my presentation the distinction between the capital cost and the operating cost and the trade-off between them. So you definitely have to pay attention to that. And there's plenty of evidence that what we have done in our metropolitan areas, and I do a lot more work on transportation, so I'm acutely aware that there have deferred maintenance to build projects, and now we're trying to come back from deferred maintenance, and if you defer that maintenance, there's also plenty of engineering evidence that your costs of maintenance then get more and more expensive because of a lot of engineering reasons. So there's also, I think, good evidence that there's a short-run view on a political cycle of trying to make the long-term investments. There's nothing very interesting about investing in maintenance and investing in operations. Capital's a lot more interesting. So having said all that, the idea of thinking about it differently, and there might be opportunities where you are choosing between two options, and you say, well, we can do it the old way, and it costs X, and we can do it the other way, and it costs 80% of X. Why don't we take that money that we save and dedicate that to an operating endowment or something, so that we can make sure that we keep the operating going, because we really don't trust people to keep paying attention to the operation. So I think those ideas, they're not used in a lot of places, but whoever wrote that question is, I think, onto an idea that we should be thinking about.
Well, we're out of time for the panel. If you have a question or we weren't able to get to it, which is actually moot because we have gotten to all but one, the panelists, the speakers will be sticking around for a while, and you can have the chance to talk to any of us. You don't necessarily want to talk to me, but them about their areas and your particular question. But in the meantime, please help me thank the panel for these very cutting-edge creative studies and all the contributions that they're going to that they've made to the planokc process, and to a really compelling and consensus-driven vision for the future of Oklahoma City.